very good reviews. So that'll be on February 22. Now on the 17th, which is next Thursday, we start our fairy tales for grown-ups right here in this room at 7 p.m. By the way, is there anybody from Warwood here today? I'm from Warwood. Welcome, Warwood. Anyway, so we'll be doing some storytelling, and we're going to learn about fairy tales as they were in the early days. And they were a lot different than you may remember them. A lot more geared toward an adult audience. Okay. I want to recognize someone who's been with us for the past 8 years. You know her as Erin. She is leaving to take another job. Unfortunately, I having a hard time with it myself. She has been irreplaceable for that time and made me kind of lazy because she does all the hard stuff. And well, let's have her come out here. She really did a great job when I wasn't here and when I was here, improving our programming, and I thank her for everything she did. And I wish her luck in her new job. I know you all did. Okay, our guests today, Dr. Martha Lash is professor and interim director, School of Teaching, Learning, and Curriculum Studies, and professor at Kent State University and McNair Scholar Mentor. Ms. Monica Cooper is director of scholars, Catalyst Academy Public Charter School, Pittsburgh, PA, also Kent State University and McNair Scholar alum. Here they are. They're going to tell you about Eileen Miller.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having us. It's good to be back home again. We got started on this journey about Miss Miller when I was teaching a graduate course called Professional Development and Teaching. So it was practicing teachers, and they were coming and learning more about their professional development, how to conduct professional development for other teachers in their building. And one was doing urban schools, an African-American doctoral student, and she asked us in a group of about 20 to raise our hands if we had had a teacher who was African-American. I'm going to ask you, who in this classroom, who in this room has had a teacher who was African-American? How many of those people had Miss Miller? In that classroom in Kent, Ohio, close to Cleveland, 2 people raised their hand out of 20. The African-American woman presenting and Marty Lash. We were the only 2 in the whole class. And so it got me thinking, how in the world in Wheeling, West Virginia, and Warwood did I have, back in the 70s and 80s, an African-American, 60s and 70s, sorry, having a teacher who was African-American. And so it made me curious. Then I went to an undergraduate class, and
in that undergraduate class, it was one of my first days, and Dr. Lash talked about how she's from Wheeling, West Virginia. The connection is that my family is from Wheeling, West Virginia, and every summer I would come here to Oakland Bay with my family, the Ford family, and spend a week here. And I knew that I would be a McNair scholar that summer, and I needed a mentor. And something that really stood out to me as a student was that, man, I'm one of the few African-American students in a class about teaching. And what I did not know is I would have that same experience when I went into the teaching force. And so I talked to Dr. Lash about being my mentor, and we came together to develop this research on African Americans in the field of education.
Yes, and so I said I have been curious about this situation that came up in a different class. Oops. And would you be interested in exploring that with me, going to Wheeling, talking to this teacher, seeing how she came to be at Warwood, and she was all over that because she loves wheeling too. And so the thing is, when you're doing McNair, we wanted to just jump in the car and come down and talk to her. But when you're doing research, you do have to follow some research steps. So we had our question, and then we have to go to the literature, right, when you're doing research. So in McNair, a big part of what she was doing is she went to the literature and you look at topics that you want to know about. So of course we looked up Miss Miller, we looked up Lincoln School, we looked up African-American teachers, and wow, we learned a lot that we didn't know. They didn't teach me in the teacher education program, they didn't teach me at Warwood, they hadn't taught her, I hadn't taught her. So it was good that we went to the literature. Then we do the methodology, findings, and implications. But we are going to slow down and we're going to show you or share with you some of the literature we found when we did this research topic on African American teachers.
So African Americans used to serve as teachers and role models and successful individuals that their African American students could look up to, and they were admired in their community. So why is the big question? Is there a low percentage of African American teachers in schools today? There are a few answers for that. One big thing is that over the years, careers for African Americans have expanded. Before you could, most of the time you were a teacher, a preacher, nurse, or in some cases a doctor. Since then, we've had the opportunity to expand into any field that you can think of. Then you also have some Supreme Court decisions that impacted African Americans and education over the years. You had Plessy versus Ferguson, which we'll talk about in a bit, and then you had a big one, which was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So Plessy versus Ferguson preceded Brown in 1896. This was what we know as separate but equal. By the time we get to 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education started, we know it was separate, but it was not equal. And so that Brown versus Board determined that separate education facilities they just weren't equal. So this is what they decided to do. We're going to integrate schools. The thing here is that they did not give guidelines to say, they didn't give a timeline. They didn't say how this was to be done. And it didn't address African American teachers or administrators, which is something that we just wanted students to be integrated. No one thought about the impact that this would have on African American educators, no longer being a major part of, schools as we move forward. So let's talk about some findings that we have. Teachers faced oppression after integration. Brown versus Board happened. In some states, such as Mississippi, it took 10 years for schools to be integrated. In some states, they were integrated a little bit more quickly. When they were integrated, teachers of color, African American teachers, face oppression by various strategies to keep them from teaching. So one thing was unstable replacement of tenured teachers. The rehire is dependent on government funding. There was no job security, and you also had testing. So testing such as your national teacher examination or your pre-professional skills test. Testing is still something that can be a barrier even now in the 21st century. There are plenty of people who it takes them multiple times to pass the teacher certification test. Sometimes, in some cases, people say it's culturally biased. In some of the research, we have found that testing was used specifically right after desegregation as a barrier for teachers to get into schools. Also, the demotion of principals and superintendents. Closing and consolidation of schools left black students going into a white school and integrating, but you didn't have room for two principals. So if I was an African-American principal with my African-American students, but all of my students are now getting integrated and move into another school, where does that leave me as the principal, as a superintendent, as an educator? So after the decision was made and schools were integrated, we know that many teachers were demoted. They were dismissed from their career. They were displaced, meaning that some teachers or principals, they ended up in central office. So they didn't go back into a building to teach. They ended up somewhere else in education, or they just did not go back to education. Another piece of information is that some teachers who were retiring, they were not replaced with more African-American teachers. They retired and that was the end of that. So there was a major displacement of 32,000 Black teachers, and that's really only counting the southern bordering states that were affected by Brown. That's not including anything north of the Mason-Dixon line. What does this loss mean of all the African-American educators? Well, the unique teaching style, strict with a high demand of high expectations, what we now call warm strict, or a nurturer, and then relationships with students in those communities. So a lot of times what you would hear people experience pre-Brown is, I went to school with Mr. Such and such, and he lived down the street, and my dad grew up with him, and our families had dinner together, or we had close-knit families, and so that took away from that sense of community in the Black community, because now I don't have a principal who looks like me. I don't have that teacher who kind of understood me and the things that were going on in my life and could give me that warm, strict love that I needed to succeed and overcome barriers. So let's look at our research questions.
So that's what you do. After you look at the literature, you go back and look at your original question, and then you modify it. Does it need to be modified? And how do you do that? So we still have the question of where are all the teachers of color in the classroom today, but we expanded it to think about teachers who taught before, during, and after integration, what we can learn from Brown versus Board of Education, and how did the teachers feel, the African-American teachers feel about that. And because many of you may have grown up in a time and not knowing that, so in all of the African-American schools, only African-American teachers and principals and administrators. In the white schools, and this is certainly, in the South and the bordering, would be white teachers, white administrators, and that. So that's why saying that the children would be integrated, but not talking about the teachers, kind of created this ripple effect that we feel even today. So here we have Miss Eileen Miller. Then we're ready to come down, and we interviewed her. We went to her home in Fulton, and we had a 3-hour oral history. She was 87 years old at the time, and she had had a stroke at that point, but she was still doing very well. She was Miss Miller, no doubt about that. When I said, "How are you, Miss Miller?" she said, "Ready to jump up and run around." And that's kind of her energy level. And then it was 3 hours. That's kind of a long time for a person who's 87. And I said, "Are we doing okay?" Later in the interview, and she said, "You can't wear me out. You let me know when I wear you out." So does that sound like Miss Miller? So she hadn't changed from her days at Woodwood in those ways. Early years, we'll just do a little bit. She said, "I was born at home, and by the way, I was born in the principal's home. Yes, my parents rented an apartment above where they lived, and he had children, and those children became my playmates and went up and graduated with me. His daughter and I were very close. Her name was Catherine, and she became a medical doctor." She says, "I had 2 brothers, no sisters. My sister died before I was born. I grew up with 2 brothers, 3 babies, and the boys, Mama wouldn't let them leave me for anything. I became a Boy Scout before I became a Girl Reserve. I had to go with Henry to the Boy Scouts. I even did one of their obstacle courses that they had to do. He put the rope around me and I was part of it too. So some really fond memories. She loved talking about her siblings. And
so let's jump into some more stories she shared. From the beginning, as a youngster, around 5 or 6 or 7, I went into school the first day or so. I was very impressed with my teachers, and I decided that I would like to be one. In the summertime, you know how little girls and boys would pretend to play pretend that they are somebody. My brother Thomas always wanted to be a preacher, so he would preach. And I always wanted to be a teacher, so I would teach. So every chance that I got, I would have 2 or 3 kids lined up teaching as a youngster. And as I went through school, there was nothing I felt was an imposition as an assignment to learn. I was always like a sponge, ready to suck it all up and enjoy doing it. I always enjoyed my classroom and my teachers. I would select a certain point of outstanding gestures, one that my teachers would seem to be prone to using, and I will always remember that.
so there we see her with her models and teaching and incorporating that into her work. So one thing that's clear is we remember Miss Miller. She was a leader, right? She also believed in hard work, not just for herself, but for all of us, right? But here's some things she had that we see even when she was a young child. I can remember very distinctly on my 3rd grade level, I had a teacher that was quite inclined towards preparing for things like games. You know, she liked competitive games and calisthenics and so forth. And I was good with the calisthenics on 3rd grade level. I was the one. I led the group and the whole school. We were at Wheeling Island Stadium for our field day, and I led the whole school. She led Lincoln School in 3rd grade in calisthenics. I love that story. And she says, I always had a position where I was a leader in some way, even in my YW work. We were the girl reserves. We weren't the Y teens. We were the girl reserves, and I was like president or something like that, or a representative, and that I would go and report each month at the big Y, where different ones in different localities would come and make a report of what the club was doing. I asked her where she got this, like, what did she think? And repeatedly throughout the interview, she would say, a large part of it was my mother. She was my mentor, so to speak. Nothing seemed to stop her, and she put it into me too. She showed me what I could do, and nothing was too inferior for me to do. I ran every elevator in town. I ran the elevator at McClure, at the Windsor, at J.C. Penney. Remember when we had that? And she was putting herself through college when she was doing some of that. She'd come home in the summers and do that. Here we have, and it's a bit hard to see, but you can see it on the websites too, a brief history of Lincoln School, because this is where Miss Miller went as a young girl, and then as a student, when she was doing her calisthenics and her leading and her Y work and imitating teachers that she liked. Lincoln School was found, I gotta grab my glasses here. Sorry. I'm just going to read you the middle part, and you can see some of the photos from around. Lincoln School was founded in 1866 and was among the first public schools established for Negroes in the United States. A 2-room house was secured in Wheeling, West Virginia. The first few principals were from surrounding areas in Ohio. One of the pivotal principals, James McHenry Jones, became an outstanding leader in the field of education and among his people. During his administration, the school was raised to a high standard of competence. He remained a principal until 1900, when he was appointed as the president of West Virginia Colored Institute of Institute, West Virginia. In 1875, the school moved a few blocks into the former Second Ward School building, which had been used by white children. After the school was given over to the colored pupils, this is the historical record, okay? It was called Lincoln School in honor of the immortal Abraham Lincoln. In 1893, a new building was constructed, and again in 1943, a new Lincoln High School was constructed, and that's still standing today. Although laboring under great handicaps, nevertheless, because of superior trained teachers, Lincoln High School has achieved high honors in competition with other schools in athletics, literary, and declamatory contests, and other activities. Lincoln graduates have been able to enter the various colleges in the country. So this is the kind of education that she grew up with. So here's a little bit, picture of Miss Miller from a Warwood High School yearbook. Some of you may recognize that. I had to go in though, when Sean showed me the promotion, and this particular photo and description was on there. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Miss Miller didn't go to West Liberty State College. She wasn't allowed to. At her age, that college, it was a college then, it's a university now, was only for white students. African-American students would not have been admitted to West Liberty, would not have been admitted to West Virginia University in Morgantown. So Miss Miller, so I put the correction in there. She went to West Virginia State College in Institute, West Virginia, where one of the former principals, had gone. So you can see kind of that evolution there. And it's historical Black college and university. So in West Virginia, from what I looked up, we had Institute, and then in Bluefield, where African-American students went. So she graduated from Lincoln in 1938. She attended West Virginia State College, Institute, West Virginia, and she loved it. She loved being down there. Boy, she came to life. But she was like, I had boyfriends, I was very popular, they all liked me. I was like, she wanted me to know, like, I might be Miss Miller to you, but in Institute, I had a lot of boyfriends, and I didn't want to come home. 2 weeks after graduation, she was still at university. She was still at college, 2 weeks, and she said, my mother called down to Institute and told them to send me home. Lots of boyfriends and one special one, but at the time, you couldn't bring boyfriends because if you wanted to be a teacher and you were female, you were not allowed to be married. So, or it would have been Mrs. So-and-so, I don't know, but we knew her as Miss Miller. Yeah, right? And she told me this more than once in the interview. Yeah. So I also enjoyed preparing myself to be a teacher. When I went to college, I enjoyed college very much, and I remember a number of teachers said that I was quite well prepared for the classroom, that they were going to offer me some more instructions for. They said, where are you from? I said, Wheeling. And they would say to somebody from New York, now here she is from Wheeling, West Virginia, and you are from New York City, and she knows this and knows that, and she knows more than you do. But the thing, she says, but the thing was, we had quite a faculty at Lincoln at the time. We had some masters, we had some PhDs, we had some authors who were their teachers. So she did come home. She was hired at Lincoln. She had befriended a neighbor. She had given him some pound cake. He invited her over, him and his wife, and she said, well, my mom just made some pound cake. You want some pound cake? And he said, yes. So she took him over a big slice. She said, my mother was very generous. I know she would have wanted me to take. And so he ate it right up, and she said, well, do you want some more? And he said, yes. So she went back and got some more pound cake. And when her mom got home, there was only half a pound cake there, but the neighbor had eaten it. Turns out later, this neighbor took her to the Board of Education and introduced her to some people that he knew there. So she said, be nice to people. You don't know when it's going to help you get that job. So she, in that particular position, she was a substitute for somebody who had been in World War II. He was, the soldier was in World War II. He came back from the war. He took his job back, and she lost her job. Soldier returned. She lost her job. She went to Pittsburgh this time. and reported. Are you ready? I had the time of my life. Yeah. Every time she was there for 1 year, she tried to get a job in social work. She was doing fine in Pittsburgh when who should call but Lincoln School again. And this time it was to replace a retiring teacher. And she came back and she started teaching at Lincoln. She replaced Miss Ella, who was her favorite teacher. She said, the best teacher I ever had. She was the one that loved you. If you were having difficulty, she would invite you to come to her home. She would put you around a table that had a Tiffany lamp over it and instruct you. Extra instruction. And you wouldn't be the only one there. She might have 2 or 3 other students there in the evening after school. So you get this feeling of Lincoln and the community and the teacher's role and the principal's role and all that at that time period. However, after a few years of teaching there, more changes would occur with Brown versus Board of Education decision. So now we get to hear from her. Okay. Was it on?
It was quite a change, and we were very concerned about where we would be placed. It was understood that we would be placed in a school.
It was understood. That was going to be one of my questions.
Yes, it was understood that the teachers at Lincoln would be placed into a school. Not everybody at the same school.
Right. Were the students going to all different schools also?
They had an option to either stay at Lincoln for another year before they moved us out, or go to another school.
What did they do?
Some went and some stayed.
Were the students worried? Were they excited about going to different schools? You said the faculty were a little bit concerned. Did they have a job?
The children were excited, yes.
The children were excited?
Yes.
The kids were excited to go to the various schools?
Yes.
Were you excited for them?
Yes,
Or worried? Or
I was somewhat worried, but I was also excited. I just wanted to, how they would get along, whether they would respond well or not.
And then she went on to say, and yes, that worried me. And Reed was the principal, made such a big deal out of it, because he said the students wouldn't get the attention that we gave them. Our Lincoln faculty had teaching license, master's degrees, and doctorates. Some are authors. Oh, I tell you, it was something. And every kid that went to Lincoln should feel like I did. They learned triple the amount at Lincoln that they would learn anyplace else.
It was quite a change, and we were very concerned about where we would be placed. It was understood that we would be placed in a school.
It was understood. That was going to be one of my questions. Okay, and so to clarify, in Wheeling, we had talked, Monica had mentioned some states didn't integrate for 10 years. In Wheeling, the Brown decision occurred in 1954, and within a year or two in Wheeling, the schools were integrated. Okay, so that's what she was saying with that transition year. So it wasn't in 1960 something like some states, it was in the 50s. Okay.
So now a lot about when desegregation happened. And did you want to switch schools? Did you prefer to switch schools, or it just didn't matter as long as you had a job?
As long as I had a job, I could teach anywhere. And it didn't matter to me who I taught.
You said you didn't have any experiences with negative actions or comments, or
No.
when you moved to Rosewood, did you know anyone who did, or did you know anyone who had a hard time finding a job after the desegregation?
No.
So everyone you know.
Everybody was placed.
Oh, okay. That's a good thing to know.
Everybody was placed in a position, not necessarily their background or what they were prepared for, but they were placed in a teaching position, or just like our principal became, an associate out in, the board office.
Okay.
Philip Reed.
Okay, so he
Not
had,
the board office.
so he had been the principal at Lincoln, and he went to administration.
Yes.
So everybody was placed, did they keep their jobs over time? Did you have any, like professional development training provided by the school to help you, get acclimated to being at a new school, integrated school? Did they help?
No, not per se, but I did keep 2, certifications by going every 5 years and renewing one or the other of my elementary or secondary certifications. That's the reason I never got a master's, and I should have.
Oh, you think?
Yes, but I would have had to select a field.
Oh.
So I want, you can see, she was for 87 and having a stroke, she had quite a good memory there. I want everybody who attended Warwood and had Miss Miller to brace yourself. This news was surprising to me. So, ready?
And then what happened with you and your friends who were teaching there? You went to Warwood, right? How did that happen?
I don't know how it happened, but I got along fine.
Okay, yeah, you didn't ask to go to Warwood or whether they just said, you're going here, you're going there. Okay. I thought maybe you wanted to come teach us. I didn't know.
No, I didn't select you, they put me there.
You were happy to have a job?
Yes, and then when I got there and I had so much help, and the teachers took me out to a place over in Ohio for dinner and everything. Feed me so nice. I had all kinds of treats.
So they welcomed you.
Well, it was quite well. Like I said, I had those 2 students that were taking care of me and me, don't do this way, you do this way and that way and other way.
And this is,
They had me all lined up.
We're going to hear from those 2 students, but her point about being able, like she would teach anyone, that's why I wanted to brace you. I thought, oh, she chose us at Warwood. We were, you have that favorite teacher and you think that, yeah, no, that wasn't the case. She could teach anyone. She also taught a lot. She talked about when she was at Warwood, she was all these different nationalities. It's just so different to her. She's like the Irish, the German, just it was different for her. She also talked a lot about when she taught adult students in South Wheeling. And she'd say they would keep my phone busy all summer telling me if they passed the GED or not. So she was tutoring them to be able to, the newer immigrants to pass their GED. So let's hear about those 2 students. Whoops. These are the 2 students.
And they were just like that. And their lockers were outside my classroom. And every day, when the first year that I was there, every day they would be upstairs when I came to school.
they were early.
Guiding me, telling me what was gonna happen. And like,
Really?
yes, the secretary downstairs had done it, Mrs. Eagle about it. And I come upstairs and those 2 would be up there giggling and laughing and kicking and hitting and get her straightened out. So this, that, other is going down. We won't do this, we won't do that, but tomorrow we're going to have such and such a thing. They kept me in love.
They did.
They helped me a lot.
So we talked, so we asked Miss Miller to continue to talk about some of her experiences, and she highlighted some Warwood teachers that welcomed her. She talked about, there we are. She talked about Virginia Lynch, who opened her arms to her, and the Fair sisters. And she said she could walk to Lincoln, but she had to catch the bus to Warwood. And she had to take 2 buses each way. And she didn't drive until she was 50, which I thought was a very surprising fact because she's such a go-getter. And so she talked about how she rode the bus, and sometimes the Ferris sisters, if they saw her standing out at the bus stop when they rode by, they would pick her up and take her to school and give her a ride. I also, as you heard in the tape, asked her about, was there any prejudice that she experienced? And her response was, so no, there was nothing like that, the prejudice going on with me. Well, there was one teacher, and my brother was a house painter, and he worked for her, but she didn't know until she knew it. She was ignoring me, so I finally let her know who I was. I told her I was Henry's sister, and she replied, oh, yes. And after that, she didn't ignore me, and she changed her tone of voice. And another thing here, this was very surprising to me as a younger woman in education before I actually started to practice. She said there were a number of years that she was teaching when females were not allowed to get married. The males could get married, but the females couldn't. I have an idea why. And even so, I still feel that was somewhat unfair. And another factor was sometimes the salary was deflated for women from the men's salary from what I remember, and that was unfair. And so she talks about her experience as a teacher, and so though she may not have experienced much racial prejudice, she did experience some sexism around, I can't get married because I'm a female, and I have these certain jobs and parameters that I need to stay in, and then my pay is not equal to what a male teacher makes.
So we found that very interesting. So that was I would say some women's issues across more than race at that time. Now, if you can see this picture, a lot of us will remember her. That's what she looked like, right, at her lectern, right, and giving out the words and teaching and telling. And she said, oh, let me tell you about that lectern. One day I was giving the spelling words, and you give the word in a sentence. I was taking care of my mother at that time. My mother had Alzheimer's. I stayed up all night with her, and I was trying to make it. This class was right after lunch, and I'm standing up there at the podium giving out these words. I don't remember what the word was, but whatever it was, I gave a sentence that didn't go along with it. And you want to know what? I had fallen asleep standing up. I told her, you probably taught better in your sleep than some teachers teach when they're awake. But anyway, we didn't put that. And she said, I had fallen asleep standing up, and the kids realized it, but they didn't say anything. They didn't laugh or anything. Of course, we would have been intimidated. They just looked at me. When the bell rang and they left, this one little boy looked around the side of the door. Good night, Miss Miller. He said, somebody had to get me, you understand. They let me know what had happened. So she had a great sense of humor. And here's another one. Every September, I lost my voice because of that band under me. Talking over a 100-piece band practicing was not fun. Good director and everything, my doctor's father. I think that would be Mr. Mercer and Dr. Mercer. Anyhow, I told the kids once about 5 years after I had suffered so. I said, bring any noisemaker you want when you come to school tomorrow and put them in my room. They brought drums, they brought tubs, buckets, and horns, everything that would make noise. So I let them put me in the room. When that 5th period class came and that band struck up, I said, okay, kids, let's go. 1, 2, 3. And boy, we hit it. All that noise, and the band downstairs making its noise. Next thing I know, Mercer was upstairs, peeping in my window on the door. He peeped, but he didn't say anything. He went on back downstairs. I don't know. I told the kids to stop because I didn't want him to bring the principal. I made my point, and after that, they never practiced under me again. And they'd go out marching somewhere, take it to the street, and the principal didn't say a word either. Nobody said a word to me. She was funny, yeah. Okay, so if you remember our little research, there are a few implications. We wanted to save some, we have just a few more slides because we wanted to save some time for questions and answers. But here are some of the implications that we found. I'm going to do the first one and then we're both going to speak to the second one. We can do better. Remember when they were worried what would happen? Miss Miller noted, so this interview happened, remember, in 2008, when she went to a Wheeling Park High School chorus event, that there was not one African-American student in the entire choir that night that she was there, and she found that unusual. I did too. So if you were doing research on this, that would be the topic. You'd start like, okay, let's go look at these groups and who was in them. And there's a better way to say that. The Warwick principal shared with Miss Miller that he had made an unprofessional remark about a mixed-race child to Mr. Reed at the administration. He was the former Lincoln principal. She said, "Oh no, you shouldn't have said that." What did he say? She shared that Mr. Reed didn't jump all over him or beat him down, but noted, "There's a better way to say that," is all that principal, that Mr. Reed had said, and then the Warwick principal learned. I'm going to go first, but as an educator, when you're talking about these topics, a lot of times I think we have to give ourselves this little bit of leeway. I learned from Mr. Reed that there's a better way to say that. Talking about some topics such as race and education are sensitive topics, they're important topics, and we're learning. Racism is learned. We can unlearn it along the way. We might say some things that we might think, there's a better way to say that. And so the next time we learn and we say it the better way.
And to that point, sometimes we all bring an implicit bias to wherever we go, because that's just the way we have morals, we have values, they differ from each other. And so even I, as an African-American educator who educates African-American children and impoverished or low students from a low socioeconomic status, I have to watch what I say. It's really about saying what you need to say in love. And so that part always, it was a resounding piece to me when I was a student, and now that I am a leader in education. There's always a better way to say something. There's always a way to get your point across in love and with concern, whether you are talking to a child who is the same race or you have the same experience, or you are talking to someone from a different experience. And so that's something in education that we have to be extremely careful about with our students, because they're the future. And I know how I experienced two different teachers in my life, and thank God they came back to back, because one did a lot of damage, and the very next year, the next one managed to undo all of that damage. And I wouldn't be the educator I am today without both of those teachers. The teacher who said those things that I just was taken aback by, and then that third grade teacher right after who was able to teach me and show me love, the love that I needed that I missed the year before. So that's something we can all take with us wherever we go.
Just two more slides here. One, so we know then the history of Wheeling. We kept the African-American teachers and administrators kept their jobs. So that was something we found out different from the literature. The literature also talks about fabulous African-American teacher leaders in their schools, and we met Miss Miller, and she definitely fits in that area. One thing that was different is Lincoln School, the one that's still standing, was built in 1943. So in 1954, it was relatively a new school, but it was not used as part of the integration plan. The students went out to other schools, and in fact, Lincoln School then was used by Hennepin County Schools for children with special needs for several years, special education. Guess what happened when inclusion came around and children were included from special needs? They said, back to separate is inherently unequal. We need to include those. So it was kind of interesting in that history, and then the schools used today for juveniles. So our findings didn't match, so of course then we wanted to keep searching. So we did interview a few more teachers in that situation, one in North Carolina, one in Mississippi. You'll have to come back for that program on a different day. Okay, and I want to have a special note of thanks. Tommy Miller, can you stand up? This is, thank you. Tom, when I was trying to get a hold of Miss Miller in 2008, she wouldn't pick up the phone because she didn't recognize my number. So I got busy in the phone book and we found Tommy Miller. Tommy Miller, retired firefighter, runner, Head Start bus driver, and nephew of Miss Miller. And he helped us connect with her. He went out to the house. He helped us get set up with our recorder and everything. And I'm so glad you're here today. We really appreciate it. And then I would like to thank a classmate of mine, Shauna Leary, who is afar, but I think hopefully online, who read and provided invaluable feedback on the journal article garnered from this oral history that Monica and I wrote. Sean helped me plow my way through that. Both of us plow our way through that. And it was that article that got read by one of the librarians here, and then this program happened. So thank you. Thanks, Tommy. Okay, let's open it up to some stories or some questions about Miss Miller or your experiences. You heard ours. Yes.
Just a comment on Mr. Reed. Actually, when Mr. Reed left Lincoln School, he came to Washington Elementary. I just get all choked up. He was my 5th grade teacher, and he was a teaching principal. So he had to teach and be the principal. And he set up like a class government. And we were only 5th grade, and sometimes I got to be the boss.
Imagine that. Imagine that. Yeah, that's
and I
good.
became a teacher.
Yep.
But he was, and I had Miss Miller for 6 years.
I-
Both of those people were so influential in my life. I can't tell you, but Mr. Reed first had to go from being a full principal to being a teaching principal in an elementary school in Northfield, in Washington School. Some of you remember Washington.
That's good to know. And this is kind of part of the value with oral history. It's what she remembers, right? And at 87, she was remembering and grabbing names pretty good, but some of the
Well, then he did
details.
go to the county office
Yeah.
after that, but first
Yeah.
he had to be.
But for me, that was always like a point of pride that everybody at Lincoln kept their jobs. You know? Yeah. So I'm glad you had that experience. We can see the value of having teachers who look different from you, as well as teachers who look like you. I think there was another hand up back there too. Hi.
I don't know if you want to get into this. I was reading the morning paper, and it really upset me. There's a new bill in our legislature regarding the teaching of race in schools. And it's quite scary what they're proposing. There's no real reason West Virginia hasn't asked for the bill. It sounds like, well, I should. Anyway.
That will surely be an entire another program if we're going to talk about that. But we do, children do talk about race in school. I will, as a teacher, I will tell you, there's a lot going on in schools. There's reading, writing, arithmetic, critical analysis, social studies, music, art, dance. We've got a lot going on in school. So yes, there are topics that are brought up that are current, but there's a lot that has to be taught in schools. So I didn't see that article, and I'm not prepared to go down that rabbit hole today.
I would like to know about, we talked about Mr. Reed and Ms. Miller. Were there other teachers from Lincoln? And where did they end up? And what was their story? Or do you know it?
So they were all placed. So yes, I remember she said some went to the island, some must have gone to North Wheeling, some must have gone to South Wheeling. Tommy, can I share what you told me a little bit ago about Warwood? Or do you want to share it?
Well, no.
No.
Only because that's not who she was.
That's right. All right, we'll leave that one. Yeah, so we had not explored all that, but they were somewhere. And I mean, she even said, she was talking about these wonderful teachers at Lincoln. She said, there was one, it wasn't so good. Even she got placed, right? She said, she said, I had her in 4th grade. And then I talked with her, she's doing the same thing. She'd like give the students something to do and she'd be like reading the paper or something, So there's one in every school, I'll tell you, there's one in every school. So I think that's a great project. I would like to know what happened to those other teachers and where they went. Yeah.
I only knew her because it was like,
Do you have any what?
I was at Ritchie.
Oh, you were at Ritchie.
For 5 years.
I remember too, Miss Green and Miss Busby from Webster.
From Webster, so you remember teachers, so you went to
I
Webster.
never had one black teacher.
And you went to Webster and then Wheeling High,
I went to Clay School and I graduated from.
and not one African-American teacher, not one black teacher.
They were there. I just never had
You didn't end
one.
up, now, the thing with Miss Miller, but she taught different subjects, but kind of my age range, grade, she was teaching all of 8th grade English. So if you were in 8th grade, you had her. So, right? Is that right? Right. Yes, help me. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah.
I'm originally from Wellsburg. If you ever go to Wellsburg, you go down that hill, there's a gas station, there's a building on the right for the buses. I went to that school, it's called Carver School, and we had Philip Johnson and Miss Mildred Kent.
And where, did they come from Lincoln?
I don't know, Mrs. Kent was from Wheeling. I don't know where she come from, but that's who we had. It was predominantly black school, but we had whites there too.
Okay, so that's a good recollection. There's a hand in the back. Thank you. It's interesting, you say a name and you get some gasp, like, oh yeah, I had that person. Yeah, that was a good experience or not. Yes.
I'm old enough that I was in grade school when integrated, I was at St. Albans, and at the time there were 2 junior highs. I was in grade school, my brother was in junior high, and one had been serving the African American community and the other the white community. And so when schools were integrated, it just divided the town geographically. And so we lived, I happened to go to school in Hampton, the African American school. Some of the best teachers I have ever had were at that school, and I still remember their names and what they taught and what a great influence they were on me. And when I went into high school, we happened to be on vacation, my family was on vacation down in the south somewhere, I think in Louisiana, at a campground. We were talking with the other kids who were there at the campground. They were asking, well, what classes are you going to take next year in 10th grade? And I said, well, I was going to take integrated geometry, which was integrated plane and solid geometry. That was the name of it. And this girl looked at me and she said, is everything integrated up there? So it makes me wonder about West Virginia. And my question is, we never think of West Virginia as being a leader in it. The fact that we desegregated quite early, I think is commendable for West Virginia.
And remind me the town you said you grew up in or the city?
St. Albans.
Okay, St. Albans. I didn't. Hi, I know you. No, we think that she went to Warwood Junior High, that's their middle school. So she retired in 1983. I was trying to remember, but I think Warwood closed in 76 and then Park. And I think that she went, Mr. Kenny Cover's back there telling me I got that one right. And so did Mr. Cover. So, yeah. And Mr. Cover, can I share the story you told me about? Yeah, was in a unique position. When he went to Warwood as a student, he had Miss Miller, as many of us did, as a teacher. And then when he became a teacher at Warwood, he had her as a colleague. So that's a pretty cool story there too. Mm-hmm.
It's the idea that you teach and be married. But is that, yeah.
I can go right down. What do we have? Miss Nordeman, Miss Lynch, Miss Ferris, Miss. Fabulous teachers. Fabulous. I will say in this research, I was pretty much intimidated by Virginia Lynch as a student. I don't even think I had her as a student. I just was like shaking all the time around. I really embraced her during this literature. She did a lot of work, like when we did that lit review, we turned up some things she had done on race in Wheeling and kind of this progressive thing. She would have been a fascinating person, I think, to meet also. So that was the Times. That was the Times. And somewhere in there, it changed, even when she was teaching. But I guess then all her boyfriends were gone. I don't know. Oh, Tommy knows. Okay.
Well, back then, you didn't marry and teach. However, it was highly discouraged that you be married and teach. You know, when Mr. Reed got from my family, there were 5 siblings, and we all went to Lincoln School. So when Lincoln School closed, I was just finishing the 2nd grade. And then my brother was the very last 1st grade class to start at Lincoln School. You know, so everybody knew everybody. If you went to Lincoln School and you were black, everybody knew you, and then all the teachers knew your families. So when she mentioned Reed, that just brought up something that kind of happened in our family. So this was on Halloween. So all 5 of us were trick-or-treating. My 3 older sisters and my brother and myself. So we knew where Principal Reed lived, and we weren't too crazy about it.
It's a different perspective, right?
Back then, when we went trick-or-treating, we always had a brown paper bag with the handles on it, and a bar of soap. So when you went to someone's house, if they didn't give you anything, you would soap their windows. So we went to Mr. Reed's house. You know, back then, nobody had fancy costumes. Just wore masks like this, and then anything else, you know.
Right.
So we went to Mr. Reed's house, knocked on the door. You know. So 3 sisters, they were kind of up front. So the first thing that he would do, they would try to figure out who you were, and then they would get you some candy. So he got us some candy. So we said, took our stuff, and then we started down the road. So my older sister said, let's go back and soak this anyway. So we went back there, and we put so much soap on his door windows, his picture comes up and everything. So he must have heard us, you know. So he comes back to the door, you know, like we tried to take off the right, but he grabbed my sister by the hand. But we're trying to pull off all the so then he pulled us into the house and he took off our masks, confiscated our bags. And then next morning at school, we all had to go to the principal's office. So that was our experience. We never got over until my mom's sister, that I was giving her 2nd driving lesson. So we're coming down the hill past Mr. Reed's house, and she loses control of the car, and somehow we wind up going through his picture. So back then, I was working for the phrase. So while we're trapped in the car, listen to the sirens coming, you know, and I said, you know what? Sometimes you pay now, and sometimes you pay.
Those are some fond remembrances. Those are some great, it's a great story.
And we miss those days.
Yeah, I miss those days. And it shows you too, kind of the students, the pupils' view of things versus the teachers, you know, view of things. We have made some gains in teachers. My wonderful colleague here, Mrs. Cooper. Mrs. Cooper is married. And she's teaching, and she's leading and administrating, and she's about to have a baby. And so times have changed. Yes, times have changed. So that's a great thing.
That's what I was thinking. They didn't know they would be married because they didn't want the women to have kids.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. You're absolutely right. And so not only will she have a baby, they'll hold her job and she'll return to the school leadership after the baby.
Nobody should think that education is
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, and a lot of the integration and things we're talking, that was happening in all different fields too, as well as like, so what we say is a lot of times people look to some of the Brown versus Board with a lot of civil changes and things that happened, civil rights movements, those kind of things. So you're right, it wasn't just in teaching, but that was kind of, we're thinking of her experience. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
I just love the interviews.
Oh, no.
That's